Okay, let's jump right in. China is pouring billions of dollars into Africa. So, is this some kind of genuine partnership, or is it a modern-day power play? Well, the real story here, it's probably not what you're thinking. And what we're about to unpack might just flip the script on this whole debate.
So get this. At a recent summit, 53 out of 54 African leaders, we're talking almost the entire continent, flew to Beijing. And what happens? China pledges a staggering $60 billion in support. This wasn't just some handshake photo op. No, this was a massive statement about a partnership that is growing and growing fast.
But of course, a move this big immediately kicks up a huge global debate. On one side, people are asking, is China a real partner here, helping to lift millions out of poverty? But on the other, you hear a much darker take. Are we just watching a new kind of colonialism unfold, one designed to drain the continent of its resources?
So to really get to the bottom of this, we've got to look at the two totally clashing stories that you always hear about this relationship.
So on the one hand, you've got China's official policy, their 5 no's, where they promise, hey, we're not going to interfere in your internal affairs at all. But then you flip on the news in the West, and the headlines are screaming about debt trap diplomacy. You know, the idea that China is deliberately lending money that countries can't possibly repay, all so they can swoop in and seize their valuable assets later. 2 very different pictures.
So, which story is true? Who's right here? Well, this is where it gets really interesting, because the answer, the real plot twist, might not have anything to do with China's intentions. Nope, it's all about what African nations themselves are doing.
And to see exactly how this plays out in the real world, let's look at 2 of Africa's biggest economies, Nigeria and Ethiopia. Both have gotten huge amounts of Chinese investment, but boy, have they handled it in completely different ways.
All right, first up, let's talk about Nigeria. It's an oil-rich country, massive population. Back in 1995, they went with what you'd call a total open-door policy. They allowed 100% foreign ownership in, well, every sector. The idea was pretty simple, right? Let's just make it as easy as humanly possible for foreign cash to come pouring in.
Okay, now, let's flip over to Ethiopia. Totally different approach. Instead of throwing the doors wide open, Ethiopia put a very strategic industrial policy in place. They protected certain key local industries, but at the same time, they offered really strong incentives for foreign companies to team up with local partners in joint ventures. You can see it's a much more controlled, much more managed game plan.
And the results? I mean, they couldn't be more night and day. Nigeria's open door has mostly just led to a heavy reliance on oil, and for 2 decades, their economy hasn't really diversified much at all. It's been stagnant. Meanwhile, Ethiopia's strategic model has lit a fire under its economy, making it the fastest growing in all of Africa. And the big reason why? Their strategy forced foreign investors to actually contribute to the local economy, building up local skills and making sure capital stayed inside the country.
And you know what? We see this exact same story play out when we look at something called special economic zones. This was actually an idea China suggested to help kickstart industrial growth, basically by creating these special hubs with tax breaks and better infrastructure to attract companies.
But again, it's all about how they did it. The execution was everything. Nigeria's zone was very top-down, government-led, and it has struggled for more than a decade. It only has 14 companies operating there. Ethiopia's, on the other hand, was privately run, more bottom-up, and it's absolutely thriving with over 80 companies. Think about that. Same partner, China, same basic idea, but the outcomes, worlds apart.
So this really brings us to a super important point. The success or failure of all this Chinese investment, it doesn't really seem to depend on China at all. It all comes down to the strategy of the African government that's getting the money.
And once you realize that, it leads to this powerful conclusion that just completely flips the conventional wisdom on its head. It turns out this whole story is really about Africa's hidden leverage.
See, the common story we're always told is that African nations are poor, they're desperate, they're just deal takers who have absolutely no power to set the terms. But what if that entire story is just wrong? The evidence we're seeing suggests that maybe paradoxically, they're actually the ones holding some pretty powerful cards. Think about it. African nations have immense leverage because they have a treasure trove of exactly what a country like China needs right now. We're talking vast natural resources, the world's cheapest labor force, and the last great frontier for industrialization on the planet. Okay, still not convinced? That's fair. Well, let's look at what happened when one country decided to put this hidden leverage to the ultimate test.
All right, back in 2008, Zimbabwe passed a really tough law. It demanded 51% local ownership for all major companies. And what happened? Western investment basically collapsed. They packed up and left. But Chinese investment, it skyrocketed. So why? It's because for China, getting access to Zimbabwe's resources was way more important than having 100% ownership. This is like Exhibit A that African nations can set the terms when they decide to.
Okay, so this brings up a really fascinating question, right? If African nations have all this power, this leverage, then why don't they all use it? Why isn't everyone acting like Ethiopia or Zimbabwe?
And the answer, so often, comes down to one thing: perception. This quote here from a Nigerian national minister, wow, it just says it all. After decades and decades of hearing this narrative about the poverty trap, some governments just don't believe they have any leverage. They don't think they have any cards to play. It's a classic, tragic case of a self-fulfilling prophecy.
But here's the crazy part. On the ground, Chinese investors are telling a completely different story. They see Africa as the next huge opportunity. I mean, they're so eager that they openly say they're willing to play by almost any local rules just to get in on the action. The disconnect between these two perceptions is massive, and honestly, it's that perception gap that's holding some nations back.
So, where does this all leave us? What's the big takeaway from this incredibly complex, continent-spanning relationship?
Well, it's this. The future of the continent isn't being dictated from an office in Beijing. No way. It's being actively written and negotiated and shaped, country by country, by Africans themselves. This isn't a story about Chinese power. It's a story about African agency.
And that understanding, well, it forces us to completely reframe this whole debate. We need to stop asking what an outside power is doing to Africa and start asking what African nations are doing with the incredible opportunities being presented to them.
So, you see, the really important question isn't just what is China doing in Africa? The real question, the one that's much more powerful, is what are African nations doing with China? And that, well, that changes everything, doesn't it? The power is there. The real question is, will more African leaders realize it and seize this moment to write their own story?